And so Janet, who was younger than me, needed a date. And she couldn't find any young man in 1947 who had a decent suit. Janet's mother said, "Oh, Mark got his uniform. Be your date." She called my mother called me. She needs a date because the princesses are going to be there.
You're listening to The Wisdom Project, a podcast produced by the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History in the University of Kentucky Libraries. I'm Doug Boyd. It seems to me that lately we've been hearing a great deal of news about the British royal family, especially about Queen Elizabeth. The popular and somewhat controversial Netflix show The Crown was very successful in this year's Emmy Awards. Also in April of this year, Prince Philip passed away. Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip were married over 70 years. I discovered serendipitously that this episode is being produced the week of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip's wedding anniversary, November 20th, 1947. I recently watched the first season of The Crown. Yes, I'm very behind on my television, so I'm on season 1. One of the fascinating things about that episode is that we get to see a glimpse of Princess Elizabeth before she was queen. This took me back to a moment in an oral history interview that I conducted in 2018 with Mark Lyon Thornewill. Mark Thornewill grew up in London, England, attended Dartmouth Royal Navy College beginning at the age of 13. He served in the Royal Navy during World War II. He was later ordained as a priest in the Anglican Church of England, and in 1966 moved his family to the United States and settled in Louisville, Kentucky. With all this talk about the royal family and Queen Elizabeth and watching that first season of The Crown, I've been thinking a lot about a particular story told during this interview. Mark sets up the story. It's 1947. His ship is in port. He's still in the Navy at this time. He was invited to a party as the date of a family friend named Janet. This was not just any party. This was a party that Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret would be attending.
1947, I was in HMS, another destroyer, sitting at Portsmouth, and my mother's best friend with Navy connections, who had 2 daughters, Doily Hughes, their name was, and these girls had been invited by an English family who also had connections with the royal family, princesses, at school. And this family, Lord Ranald Rod, his oldest daughter, was having a coming out party. She was going to be 18 in 1947. And the princesses were invited because they had a school connection, both with the Reynolds of Rod and also with my friends, the Doily Hughes. And so Janet, who was younger than me, needed a date to go to this dance. And she couldn't find any young man in 1947 who had a decent suit. And if the royal family were going to be there, you had to be dressed up. And then her mother, Janet's mother, said, "Oh, Mark's got his uniform. Let's call the Thornwills, see if he could be your date." She called my mother called me. "Janet wants you at her date." This was on Thursday. The party was on that Saturday, 2 days ahead. She needs a date. Somebody who's got uniform who can be her date because the princesses are going to be there. See if you can get off. I was sitting in my ship, HMS, whichever, in Portsmouth. And so I went to my commanding officer. I said, "Sir, my family friend, I know we were due to sail on Sunday. This was on Thursday. The party was on Saturday." I said, they want me up in London for this party on Saturday night. My commanding officer said, well, get your ass up there, boy. Up I went, in my uniform. Big party, Grosvenor Square, central London, in the private ballroom. Both the princesses there. I was sitting at the table with Janet. And the orchestra played the first set of music. Nobody danced, because that's the way things are when the royals are present. Until the royals take the floor, nobody else deigns to take the floor before them. So we went right through the first music set, nobody moving. I was sitting with Janet, so the music set ended. So I said to Janet, as soon as the first chord of this next music set, I'm going to want to go, do you mind if I go invite Princess Elizabeth? She said, do it. So I was on my feet, the very first chord. I was walking alone. I was the only person standing in the whole damn ballroom. Crossed the floor, up the steps to where the princesses were sitting with their hosts. May I have the pleasure of this dance? Yes. Off we went. Everybody started dancing. So I had 2 whole dances with Princess Elizabeth. She knew how to dance like a dream. She was relaxed. We chatted about South Africa and Prince Philip and blah, 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 blah. And then I took her back at the end of the set, took her back to her seat, went back to Janet, and when I got back there, we both observed that nobody had yet invited Princess Margaret to dance. So I said, well, okay. Is it okay if I get asked? The next set of music started. The first chord, up I stood, top, up to the princess, to the other princess. May I have the pleasure of this dance? Princess Margaret says, yes, right. And I had 2 dances with Princess Margaret. Couldn't have been more different to Princess Elizabeth. Princess Margaret was uptight, always played second fiddle to her older sister. She was uptight. I knew how to dance, but she was like stiff as a cord. And she was not at ease at all. But we had 2 dances, and then I went back to Janet and danced the rest of the evening with Janet. But the follow-up to that, that was on Saturday night. Because that was on Saturday night. On Sunday morning, I went back to get back to the worship on time. So. And we sailed that next day. Tuesday, the following week, Princess Margaret's lady-in-waiting called Janet's mother and said, who was that nice young man? So who knows what might have happened if I hadn't gone to see it. I might have had a follow-up. So that was pretty exciting. Connection with royals.
What was that Sunday? What was that drive back to get ready to go back out to sea? The day after you danced.
Well, I went back by train.
So you danced with 2 princesses. What were you thinking about at that point?
Who knows what I was thinking.
All part of the adventure.
Part of the adventure. That's right.
It was all part of the adventure. This was a fascinating oral history interview. Now, in full disclosure, Mark Thornewill is the father of a close friend of mine, Joanna Hay. Joanna Hay is a very talented filmmaker, close collaborator with the Nunn Center. We've collaborated on numerous oral history projects, and we have worked together on several documentaries. I thought that for this episode of The Wisdom Project, I would interview Joanna about my interview with her father. Okay, so who is Mark Thornewill?
Well, he's my dad. And he is someone who I had a hard time remembering all of his history because it was quite varied. Do you want me to start at the beginning?
Please, start at the beginning.
I mean, the beginning of what I can recall from the stories. So my dad was born in 1925 in London, England. And his father, my grandfather, was a director of the Savoy Hotel, the very, very famous, the most famous hotel in the world, the Savoy Hotel. And then they also had a farm outside of London, a house and some land on what is now, right next to what is now Gatwick Airport. So Dad grew up in boarding schools, public schools, as they're called in England. When Dad was 13, he was sent to Britannia Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, as in Devonshire, England, on the coast, not New Hampshire.
So at 13, he's sent off to Naval College.
Well, yeah, but he was at boarding school from the age of 8 on.
Right.
I mean, it started early. I think he went to l'Institut Français first, and then to Twyford as a young schoolboy, and then Dartmouth for Royal Navy training.
So he is at Dartmouth when World War II breaks out.
So Dad was at Dartmouth from 1938 to 1942, basically preparing to go to war, because World War II had already broken out. And then he did go to sea. He was sent to sea as a midshipman in 1942 at age 17.
I have a distinct memory in our interview where I asked him, you're this young man, you know that this war is breaking out, were you afraid? You see the world events beginning to unfold, and you know that this is going to happen, and that you're going to see combat. You're not just going to go out on a boat. And that, was there a sense of, at that stage, still a student, was there fear at any point?
Fear? No.
Yeah.
Not remotely. No, we were very secure. Mm-hmm. I came from a secure home, and I was in a secure school in a secure country. To heck with Germans or anybody else. We believed in our own. We believed in our own strength and sufficiency, so that all the way through school, we learned what we needed to learn to be good sailors, to be good officers, and to have a basic education. And so at 17, I was impatient to join my first ship, which was HMS Mauritius, colony-class cruiser.
His answer was really interesting.
I remember that. It was so confident, wasn't it? Yeah. I mean, this was the 1930s. The sun never set on the British Empire.
Yeah.
He is a product of that, and the greatest navy the world had ever seen. And he was a part of that, and the confidence was instilled in him. So at 17 he goes off to sea, and the war then. He finishes out the war, and then he remains in the Navy until his mid-30s as a career, naval officer.
He's in the Navy through World War II, has numerous experiences that he talked about in our interview, but he did reflect on this moment, this spiritual conversion that he had.
Yeah, it was a big deal. So in 1951, he was second in command as executive officer on HMS Grenville. And there was a midnight collision in the English Channel, and seven men died.
When I was second in command of a destroyer, HMS Grenville, the first lieutenant, we just suffered a collision. We were sinking. 7 men killed. My commanding officer was court-martialed after this event, but responsible for the collision. The aircraft carrier we were escorting, they were court-martialed because of the collision. The Italian ship, which hit us in the starboard quarter and nearly sank us, that was all at midnight that November night. And I was in charge of saving the situation, and rather miraculously, we saved the situation.
And he talked about it being having an overwhelming feeling of the divine, is the way he described it. Something that he had not been a part of his life before. He was pretty much from an atheist family.
At 4 a.m., we were limping home to Plymouth, having patched up, and at that moment, God and Christ came into my head, close, in a loud voice and saying, Mark Thornewill, where have you been? Why aren't you paying attention to me? Da, 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 da. That night turned my life around. I became Christ's man that night. And that changed the course of my life.
So he asked for some leave at that time, probably emotional leave, a mental break perhaps was happening at that point.
I mean, don't you think at some level there was some PTSD?
Must have been. So he then left the Navy and he went to the London College of Divinity to become a priest.
A priest?
Mm-hmm. In the Church of England.
So that 3 weeks later, I wrote off to the Admiralty, my naval authority, and said, please give me a leave for a week or two to get and study what's happened to me. I've had this extraordinary experience. And they said, sorry, Thornewill, we want you in Korea. And they sent me out to be the assistant operations officer to the United Nations Task Group 95.1 in 1952. And after 18 months out there, 53, I wrote off again. I said to the Admiralty, please, I need leave to study what's happened to me. And this time they said, okay, Thornewill's not going to stay with us in the Navy. Give him his leave, all he wants. So they gave me my leave. At my own expense, I flew from Tokyo to London in a British Comet, which was the first commercial jet in the world. At my own expense, I flew myself home, and I took myself to the London College of Divinity, where Dr. Coggan was the principal. He really liked me because I'd had this conversion. Rather few of his 40 men there had had a real conversion experience. They'd become Christians in the normal course of things. And so he persuaded me that I shouldn't just stay for a few weeks. He wanted me, he said, I think you've got a vocation. What, me? Vocation to priest, deacon? And he said, well, I think you should go check it out. So I did what he said, and everybody said, oh, Thornewill, you're just who we need. And I was intensely flattered because I didn't know what I was going to do next. I knew I'd put uniform on at age 13, I'd gone to sea at age 17, I was now 36 or whatever it was. Navy was all I knew. Me, be a priest? But eventually I caved in and believed that, okay, if you say so. So I stayed on there until I graduated in 56.
Tell me how he met your mother.
So Dad was invited to a dinner party at Mount Edgecombe near Plymouth. He was a friend of my mother's grandmother. He was often invited to dinner parties because he would sail into Plymouth on his ships, and he was a young naval officer, and he was always game for a party and a dinner and a dance. And so at this particular one, my mother, age 22 or so, was also invited by her grandmother to attend the dinner party, and that's when they met.
So connect the dots for me here now, because you were not raised in England.
How can you tell?
Connect the dots. How did you all make it to Kentucky?
So Mom and Dad got married in 1961 in February. Apparently it was quite the to-do. And then Mom moves from Devonshire to Yorkshire, where Dad is the curate at a parish there in Otley in Yorkshire. And then Judah and Luke, my older twin brothers, are born there in Yorkshire. And then they moved to Devonshire, back to Devonshire, nearer Mom's family. And I am born in 1965 in the rectory at Lifton, where Dad is the priest, as in Church of England priest. And then in 1966, we moved to America, all of us.
Why?
Dad decided to take a training. So Dad, this is the story I've heard. Dad came home with a flyer from Virginia for a 2-year training in chaplaincy work, how to be a chaplain. And he showed it to my mom, and she thought, this looks fantastic. Let's move to America. And then they did. So think about this. She has 3 children. I'm only 6 months old when they were planning it. 2 twins. Dad, at this point, Dad was 40 when I was born. So he'd already had this huge life of adventure and been all over the world. I mean, when you listen to his oral history, he was everywhere, in every port, in every part of the world. I don't know half of what his adventures were. So 1966, we all get on the SS France, which was a luxury transatlantic liner from England to New York. And it was me on my mom's hip, the twins who were 4 and a half, 2 dogs. We had long-haired dachshunds. My Aunt Penelope, who was 16, and my mom and dad. So Dad was 40 and Mom was like 28 or 29, something like that.
So how you
Oh, and the green van. We brought our car with us, which was my high school. I drove that green 1965 green Volkswagen van. I drove our green 1965 van with a right-hand drive steering wheel all the way through high school. And that's the car that we brought across on the ship that my dad figured out if he bought a passage for the car, it came with a couple of tickets for passengers, and he filled it with all of our belongings. We come to Virginia. He does this 2-year training. Now, this is his second time in America. So in 1948, he was sent to Washington, D.C., to the Pentagon, along as aide-de-camp to Admiral Dalrymple Hamilton. He loved America. There are photographs of him with, like, Bing Crosby and all these fancy dinner parties. I think he was quite the man about town. So that was 1948. So this idea of moving to America appealed to him. And then my mom just loved the idea of a new adventure. So here we are, this English family living in Louisville, Kentucky. One of the things I remember is when my grandmother would come to America to visit, we would have Scottish reel parties and invite the neighbors. The American neighbors didn't know what was happening to them, but we were having these Scottish reel parties just like they used to do in the grand houses.
Yeah, talk about that. Give me a visual.
Dad would completely clear out the front of the house, empty it of furniture, set up a bar, and invite the neighbors and the friends over. And my grandmother, Lady Hilaria, would teach Scottish reels to the Americans. So Dad loved to dance. He really did. And years later, I moved to Frankfurt, and then years after that, my dad moved to Frankfurt. And everyone in Frankfurt knows that my dad would dance at the drop of a hat, whether it was in public, whether it was dancing was actually happening, music would start, and Dad would start dancing.
I remember attending a Christmas party. It was my wife and daughter, and my oldest daughter. And my oldest daughter was probably 14 or 15 years old, and she was very crabby about coming to the party. She called it a talk party, the adult party. She ended up dancing the night away with your father, who told her stories, and I'm telling you, she just lit up the entire night, had the best time at this party, and couldn't stop talking about him.
What story did he tell her?
It was the story about dancing with the princesses. So talk to me a little bit about why you had me interview your father.
Well, you and I have been friends for a long time, as well as creative collaborators in our field of oral history. And so when Dad moved from his house in Frankfurt to Trayton Oak Towers in Louisville, an assisted living, his memory was starting to slip. And so you and I were like, if we're going to do this, we have to do it now. And that interview, it looks like it was January of 2018, and it wasn't months. I think each month after that, his memory slipped. So you caught you caught these memories from him. He, soon he couldn't remember. Yeah, it all just slipped away quite quickly.
I'm so glad that we were able to get that interview completed when we did.
Well, and for us, too, as his kids, we know these little snippets. Oh, he danced with the princesses. But in this interview, we heard the whole unfolding of the dance and his personality really shows up the way he tells the story in this interview, that he was the one marching across the floor to be the first person to dance with the Princess Elizabeth. He was not shy. He was enthusiastic, and he wanted to dance.
Joanna, how would you describe Mark Thornewill, your father?
Incredibly enthusiastic and curious. And especially later in his life, when the worries of making a living and raising the kids and life had been set aside. And actually with increasing dementia, he became more joyful. He became more curious. He wanted to join every group. He wanted to learn about birding. And then the next week he'd want to learn about whatever the next person he met's group was. Read a voracious reader. He read always. And very, very spiritual. Very, very spiritual. He had quite a journey, quite a spiritual journey through his life. Church of England priest, both evangelical and not. Moved to America, became an Episcopal priest, became a hospital chaplain, and then became a member of house church, and then left the priesthood and became a massage therapist, and then joined Episcopal Church in Frankfurt, and then joined the Catholic Church in Frankfurt, and then he ended up at the Anglican Church in Frankfurt, and then he ended up at the Catholic Church or the Episcopal Church in Louisville. I don't know how you describe that kind of a journey.
And through it all, he continued to dance.
He continued to dance, and he walked the neighborhoods. He walked through Frankfurt. He walked through Louisville well into his 90s. Was seen with his hat and his cane and his cape, and he was a pretty unforgettable sight. Was his dementia and his Alzheimer's increasing? But think about, a year and a bit later, COVID hits. So I drove into Louisville on March the 9th, 2020. And as I was driving in, the assisted living called me and said this was the last day they were going to allow visitors. And I had this nice visit with Dad, and I took a picture of the two of us holding a sign that said, March 9th, 2020, 2 weeks, no more visits. And we both did a sad face, and I held it up for us both to take that picture. Of course, he couldn't keep in his mind that there was a virus or that what was going on. Anyway, COVID did not... the isolation of COVID was not good for my dad. This garrulous social man did not understand why he kept being sent back to his room. So that time passed. We ended up having a really nice time with him as a family for a week in June 2020, where we all stayed together. And then he went to a memory care because he couldn't remember anything. He loved that memory care so much. They were so good to him. He was happy, happy, happy. He was full of life, full of curiosity, telling his stories to all of the staff at the memory care place. And then he did get COVID at the end of September. And then he died of COVID on October the 4th, 2020.
I'll never forget the virtual funeral.
It was remarkable, wasn't it? It brought more people together because it was virtual than it would have otherwise. I'm sure the crowds would have been quite huge here in Kentucky with all of his friends, but all of his English family, his nephews could attend the funeral because it was virtual. And all of my aunts and my cousins and people from around the world, as well as the people who had been in his more recent life. So it really was pretty amazing. And we created that that song. You know, my brothers and I, we're a musical family and also producers of video and such things. And we had just finished making a music video about the Blue House, which was about our dad. So we were able to play that at the funeral. And then I took all of these photographs. I made slideshows and stories, and yeah.
The joke was, after the funeral, we all wanted to be Thornwills.
Well, it really was something.
One last thing I was going to say is that when we did conduct the interview, and we had the interview online, you know, as the director of the Nunn Center, at the end of every year, I sort of tally the statistics, and your father was in our top 100 interviews that were accessed that year, and I kind of drilled down and realized his interview was being viewed all over the world.
Wow.
It's pretty amazing.
Well, he would love that. He would have liked that party.
The Wisdom Project is brought to you by the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History. We're part of the Special Collections Research Center in the University of Kentucky Libraries. You can watch Mark Thornwill's entire interview online at KentuckyOralHistory.org. Stay tuned for the next episode of The Wisdom Project.